Hello, and welcome to the Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun, and today we have special guest Claudia Riseborough with us today. How are you doing, Claudia?
Hi, Harry. I'm good. How are you today?
I'm doing really well, thank you. It's a beautiful sunny day in Melbourne here, and I haven't been outside yet, but I'm hoping to be able to do that later.
Me too. Me too. I do have extra warm socks on now. I'm a bit cold, but hopefully the sunshine will be nice.
Claudia, you are somebody who is very interested in something called feminist economics, is that right?
Correct. For better or for worse, that is me.
Can you tell us what that actually encompasses or means?
I totally can. Um, Feminist economics is a way of viewing economics, which is essentially how we've constructed to understand things that work in our market economy. So, the way we make transactions, supply and demand, those sorts of things. And we've always sort of thought of economics as sort of a stagnant field. So, we think of it like mathematics. It's this thing that you learn and it doesn't change. Whereas in reality, it's a way that we've used to describe the world around us in a way that we've used to understand it. And at the heart of economics is this idea that, everything has a value. And the way we tend to understand value in the capitalist society that we live in is its monetary value. And the reality to that is that when we ascribe value to something, we do it with our own biases around what we see as a valuable thing to have. So as a result, when you've got, a capitalist, quite patriarchal society, and you've got it ascribing value to different things, it's going to see things that are, considered feminine as not of much value, or in some cases, not of any value at all. And so feminist economics is a field that sort of emerged out of the 1970s and was really pioneered by a New Zealand politician, an academic named Marilyn Waring. And it was because she went into New Zealand politics and she discovered that GDP, or gross domestic product, which is the main way that we measure value and we measure the economy, didn't consider any form of unpaid labour. So that includes things that we know, like domestic and sort of like unpaid care in the home or care for others, as well as things like subsistence agriculture, that sort of thing. And so, she really pushed to have that change so that we would see value in that. Now, her work and the work of feminist economics has sort of changed over time to realize that monetary value isn't the only way of valuing something. So the field has evolved quite a lot, but at its basis, it's that there are different ways of understanding value, measuring value, and reporting on value that aren't just this is the dollar amount for this particular service or product.
Hmm. I want to go back to that idea, but earlier you said that economics is a way to kind of describe the world around us, and as it creates the systems by which we start to ascribe value, or at least like codifies those systems. Um, so, I mean, is it a science? Is it an art? Is it politics? And also, how descriptive versus prescriptive is it? Like, if we start to believe things, do they become real in this field?
Um, I would definitely say that the more we take something as the truth, the more it becomes the truth. I definitely think that that's the case in economics. If we believe that, supply is driven by demand, as in, if we have 10 people that are demanding a car, then we will supply 10 cars. Whereas the reality is that if we have 20 cars for supply, will that have also an impact on demand? And so it's about the way we sort of perceive that and what we take to be truth or economic truth in that regard. So I think that's an incredibly important thing to call out. I think we can understand the world around us in many different ways, and there's a whole variety of different ways we can describe it. We can talk about it from a very scientific point of view. We can talk about it from a very qualitative, person-centric view of, your experience of the world around you, regardless of whether that's other people's experiences. You might share similarities, but there will be differences. You can also see it as like purely mathematical. I tend to see economics as a sort of a political tool. It is a way that we describe, we're not going to describe the world around us and our experiences in economic terms in our social settings, because that would be a bit weird and a bit dorky. We don't do it. However, it is a way for us to sort of politicize the world around us and how it works. In that regard, I would see it as a sort of form of politics. Does it have mathematical components? Totally. It is grounded in sort of mathematical or in maths. However, it's not as stagnant as maths is. It's not 2 + 2 = 4. Sometimes it's 2 + 2 = 10. Sometimes it's 2 + 2 = nothing. So it depends on how we write those equations that we get those results.
It's conjuring, your specific example conjures George Orwell's 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah, there's
rewriting history.
Yeah, there's an uncomfortable amount of also like that sort of philosophical aspect to it as well, which I think is why it sometimes gets referred to as men's version of astrology, because it's got that sort of whimsical nature about it. Yeah. But I
always thought like Myers-Briggs type indicators were the astrology for men, but maybe that's just part and parcel of the business world.
I mean, totally. I mean, Myers-Briggs is being used in sort of like organizational theory now, very much so, to understand, the workplaces that we work in.
So you mentioned that the work of Marilyn Waring and this kind of new approach to saying actually GDP, which is a totally invented thing anyway, right? It's just a particular metric that everyone has placed importance on. Is itself damaging?
I will just say one thing there. What GDP is exactly is any transaction that passes through the market economy is measured. So whether that is a transaction for, buying that car, or whether that's a transaction for war armaments, or whether that's a transaction for cleaning up an oil spillage in the Atlantic Ocean, all those things are seen as a valuable transaction. Just to preface what GDP is. So there's no difference between, something that you might see as sort of like culturally or socially a positive thing to go through the market economy versus something that, like an oil spillage or a war that is, fundamentally not something that we want in society. So you can have things that are like inherently negative things, like a war, actually boosting GDP and essentially market economies around the world.
It feels like the perfect tool of like the Adam Smith and von Mises kind of school of philosophy that, the market will sort itself out, but it doesn't care about values. It doesn't know about human values. It just is.
Yeah. Yes, correct. It doesn't matter whether something is inherently good or bad, or that sort of, the ends justify the means, or the means justify the ends. It doesn't care about any of that. It is just, this passed through the market economy. There was an exchange, and so therefore GDP increases.
So how do people who believe in GDP overcome this paradox of, like why don't we just go around breaking windows to stimulate the economy, right? Because if we break a bunch of windows, then people will have to fix them, and that's increasing GDP.
There's certainly people that would say that as government actors, we do go around breaking metaphorical windows to pay to fix them. There's certainly beliefs out there about, the continuation of wars and things like that as growth stimulation, which comes back to this whole idea about how to pay for a war. Yes.
Right. So you're referencing here something written by Keynes, but also something that you wrote, a piece that's available online called "How Do We Pay for the War on Women?"
Yes.
How do those ideas combine, or what's the relationship between them?
Well, the idea behind how to pay for the war is about essentially how to fund the war effort and how to produce the necessary resources required to for Britain to go to war. And by war I mean World War II. So this whole idea around, well, you're going to stimulate things like production because you're going to suddenly be producing things like guns and all those sorts of things, tanks and whatnot, to go off to war, which could be similar to changing factories around the world to start producing face masks for an epidemic that you might be experiencing, or a pandemic, sorry, or hand sanitizer. I do own hand sanitizer from Four Pillars Gin, the company.
Wait, Four Pillars made hand sanitizer?
They have made hand sanitizer. So anyway, that's very off topic. Let's just bring that right back on in. But basically, this whole piece was written how to pay for the war, and it was at the premise it's about that we can make this good for the economy. So I did write a piece called How to Pay for the War on Women in September last year. And it starts off by discussing Marilyn Waring's work and about how it unpacks that GDP is based on two main things. Oh no, well, not GDP. Sorry, her work is based on two main things. One of them is that GDP doesn't count all this unpaid work that goes into society, which has been found to equate to, in many economies, about 40 to 50% of what GDP is. So it's quite a substantial amount of work that we're just not counting. If we go by, traditional means of counting. And then the other thing is this idea that everything that passes through the market economy is good for GDP, regardless of the fact that it might not be good for everyone, like a war. And so I start by unpacking that, and then I sort of explain that all these sort of pretty bad things happen that happen because of gender inequality, and they lead to these market transactions. And some of these market transactions will be things like, family violence services, or they might be things like, what's a really good example? They might be things like beauty products that, are fundamentally based around women trying to have the perfect body as well as men trying to have the perfect body. It's just a lot easier to talk about it from what women experience, because we talk about that a lot. We don't talk about it from men. So the article, delves into how it's really about how to pay for gender inequality and about how we actually have this sort of boost to the market economy from the sort of continuation of gender inequality and what it's sort of done to our economies in many different ways. So I didn't think that it was particularly outlandish, but it actually garnered a lot of hate online, which was an
the amount of hatred for people who have the temerity to be not a straight white man online.
Yeah, there was even a whole array of women that had a go at me about it, a whole lot of people from a whole lot of different backgrounds and experiences. But the fundamental premise was, I think that it was mainly the title of the article that got everyone up in arms, because it sort of was about war and women and men, whereas the reality, it was sort of about, the entire idea of the article was about how gender inequality sort of maintains part of economic value, because the way we value the economy is fundamentally flawed.
I think this is the maybe cynical or pragmatic side of me. If you manage to generate a particular type of outrage, that's more helpful than something that just goes unnoticed, right? At least people are engaging with it, and maybe these ideas get proliferated, hopefully to the right people who are receptive to them. But that's a whole other conversation.
What is it, that sort of thing about the early adopters, then the people that whose minds you can change, and the people that then get on board later. Then there's the people who will never, ever, ever come. And you sort of just got to let them be. and just hope that, they don't end up in positions of power, which sometimes they do.
Yeah. You just like shift the Overton window until they're freaks again. That. So, okay, if we acknowledge like GDP is not a good metric, or at least it's a metric that leads to these problems inherently that support patriarchy and other structures of oppression, what should we be measuring instead? How do we go about measuring these things like, if women counted, if the work of women and the invisible labor?
That's a very good question, and there are quite a few different schools of thoughts on this. And I think like most sort of mainstream thoughts within this space, like the less radical thoughts are, we should come up with a way of valuing things like unpaid labor and unpaid work and that sort of thing. And there's been quite a lot of work done by governments now to do those sorts of things. And that's how you're starting to get things like these percentages of, how much of, GDP would unpaid labor be, that sort of thing. So you're still getting people ascribing monetary value to it. Now, is that as far as we need to go? Well, I don't think so. And most people that, sort of are really in line with feminist economic thought would say no. However, it's sort of that fundamental thing of, you can have revolutionary change and you can have incremental change. And ultimately, you might want the revolutionary change, but you're sure as hell going to get pretty excited when even the smallest thing happens in this very, wild world we live in. So it's that classic thing of, sure, I would love for there to be a fundamentally different way of, putting value on things in our society, or accepting that some things can't have a value. Like, how do you put a love on how do you put, that's what I was going to say. How do you put a value on love, or how do you put a value on human rights? Like, there shouldn't be any amount that, you can pay.
It gets to like infinite replacement value problems.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm looking for there. Exactly. So you can want that revolutionary change to things, to that sort of part of the world, whilst also being like, I'm still going to get excited when the Australian government says, we've done this study and we've found that unpaid labour is worth this much to the Australian economy, and we need to consider that. So I see that there's benefit in progressing down that incremental change path, as well as the revolutionary change situation, because the reality is that revolutionary change takes time, whereas incremental change can happen faster. And so, I would like that incremental change of us ascribing monetary value to things to continue, whilst I also want us to be thinking about other ways of measuring value. So some of the other ways that we can measure things is we can look at things like, one thing that's really used often in feminist economic thought is around time use data. So a classic example of this, take, a sort of nuclear heteronormative or, sort of nuclear family with a mum and a dad, maybe 2.2 children or 2.1. I can't remember what the average is these days. Anyway, and you look at dad and mum and what they do over the course of 24 hours. And so at present, we often, or particularly in the past, have seen things like unpaid labour, like caring for children for hours on end and doing the dishes and cooking and looking after grandma and all those things as leisure time. But the reality is that you're working during those times. And so what we've found is that men and women over the course of the day, if you actually put that unpaid labour time as labour time, men have largely more leisure time throughout their day because they tend to more consistently work their 9 to 5 and then they have their time to themselves. So that's a really interesting way of measuring how people spend their time in their day and what value and worth that is.
It calls to mind the fight for the 8-hour movement within the unionists, and how that only really answers a subset of the larger questions about labor and how we spend our time.
Totally. And I mean, labor is a form of spending our time. And so it's sort of like, well, what else do we spend our time doing? And, how does that change and how is that different for different people? And why does some of that time we see is like incredibly valuable and some of that time we see is not valuable when it's like, well, if we just like cut out all care work, we'd have no one. We'd have no one raising children. We'd have no one looking after children. We'd have no one, looking after sick people or old people or each other. So you've got to see value in that. And I think right now is the perfect time to be having some of these conversations because, our care workers, around the world, but, like obviously I come from it from the Australian context as an Australian, like they're seen as our essential workers right now. And they're some of the like most like, the lowest pays and the lowest salaries and the people that we consider most of the time not really contributing that much to our economy. But right now, they're not just holding up our economy, they're holding up our society. They're holding up, human existence to a reason, like as dramatic as that sounds. So, it's now's a really good time to start having a conversation about, well, why do we value care as low as we do?
And that's such a striking. So, I mean, I'd love to discuss, what are the ways in which this pandemic has both revealed the problems that you've talked about in our society, but also afforded us the opportunity to move forward. So what do we see happening in terms of our government? Like, are they trying to push policies one way or another with the current crisis? I'm thinking about the analog to war, I guess, earlier that you've mentioned. Are they breaking windows at this time? B, what are the alternatives that we can push for? Like, what's the best case scenario for how we shape the future?
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, that's a really big question, and I do have to excuse that you might be picking up some of the sound from the train that goes past my apartment. So I'm sorry if that just like cut out Harry there on me. But there's a lot to unpack there. But there's a few things that I can definitely touch on in the time that we have. And I think what's really been highlighted is what sort of policy changes the government can make at pretty short notice, like quickly, that are quite big, with this money that apparently we didn't have, that are, well, essentially what they're doing is they're making people that would otherwise, like a lot of the time, live below the poverty line or just on it, suddenly have sort of like the basic access to money, like, access to the most basic amounts of money that they can so that they can live. And, everyone's acting, like this is, this can't last forever. This is such a socialist concept. Like, people are just going to want to be on welfare for the rest of their lives, that sort of thing. Well, no one wants to be just surviving. Like everyone should have the right to have somewhere to live. People should have a roof over their head. People should be safe, have a place of safety. Now, that's acknowledging the fact that a lot of people's homes aren't safe for them. But let's just, look past that a second. But, people have the right to sort of, to running water, to hot running water. People have the right to have lights go on in their homes. People have, the right to the access to internet. We work for many reasons, but when it comes to being paid, part of that pay is so that, we do it with the hope that we can increase sort of, the quality of that living and that existence. But no one, and so many people around the world are living like this. No one should have to live in a situation where they don't have those basic human rights and those basic necessities met. And that's what comes down to this whole idea of essential. And the idea is that you should have access to essential services. You should have access to healthcare that is good, effective, and the best practice that there is today. Now, if you want a hospital room covered in gold and 20 people died on your hand and foot, then maybe you're going to need some disposable income to pay for that. But everyone should have access to a hospital bed. And everyone should have access to childcare if they need it for their children. And one of the things that I find really frightening right now is that we immediately jumped on this idea of making childcare free. And so people aren't paying for childcare right now. And we did that through various means, including JobKeepers, including with paying childcare centres 50% of what they made over a particular period, so that they wouldn't need to charge their customers, as in parents. And you know, everyone's like, oh, this is lasting for X months, like it can't go on longer than that. And you're like, well, we're doing it so that people can stay in the workforce, so that people can stay working. So, you know, mums and dads at home aren't looking after, you know, their toddlers, you know, so that they're doing that whole working from home thing, or they're going to their essential jobs if they have to leave the home to go to their jobs. And it's like, well, why aren't we doing that in the first place? Because
right.
the reality is that what ends up happening is someone has to stay home because childcare is so unaffordable, and it's seen as this like luxury service. It's not a luxury. It should be, you know, it should be seen as this sort of basic necessity, you know. And so as a result, what ends up happening is childcare is too expensive. Someone's got to stay home and look after kids, and who does that tend to fall on? It tends to fall on the women in a household. And, you know, suddenly we've got this situation where that comes down to, you know, a root explanation of so many other gender inequalities in our sort of economy, society, community, and it just keeps driving it. So why don't we just keep paying for childcare? Yeah. Well, the government. I mean, the reality is that it's not that we can't afford it. We can afford anything we want at any particular time. It's just, you know, it's just a decision that the government has to make about how it's going to raise money. It can raise money through taxes. It can raise money through things like people paying for parking and pet registration and that sort of thing. And it can also print money. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the fundamentals behind that sort of policy, is that we have the option to put more money out there. Anyway.
So yeah, it's like, it's not that we can't do it. It's that the way in which we spend money reveals the values. And something that strikes me is like when the government, I'm just remembering Albo's recent comment saying we can't keep this new rate forever because it'll disincentivize people from working, which is such a funny comment, because to me it reveals that the government uses homelessness and poverty as a weapon. Like it's saying we're going to use this as the incentive for labor and work. Anyway, that's just something that's...
Those things shouldn't even be possible in the society that we live in. It should not be possible to end up homeless. But it's like we need to maintain a certain amount of it so that, you know, people work.
If you don't mind, I realize this is now the 29-minute mark, and I said I shouldn't ask questions at this time, but this is so fascinating. Just the second half of that pandemic question, which is, I mean, related to, as we see economies failing and prepared to I don't know, if I've lost faith in what's going on, what are the new societal directions, and what are the new alternatives that we can be looking forward to or be pushing our government to embrace?
Well, hopefully a lot of, you know, I mean, everything right now is COVID-19. You know, even if we're talking about something different, it's linked back to it. And so hopefully right now, what it's really doing is it's removing a lot of the masks. It's shining a huge spotlight on a lot of things that we just take for granted and keep on doing. So, I mean, hopefully what it's going to do is it's going to reveal things that, you know, can change and do need to change, and things things that have been taken as measures, particularly in the Australian context. Hopefully some of those things, can continue. At the end of the day, a lot of the amounts that people get for welfare, they're not actually affordable. You can't afford to live on them. It's not about living a better life or a higher quality of living. It's you can't pay rent, buy groceries, and pay your bills, all of which are essential. You cannot do all that on what you're being given. So hopefully it will shine enough light on that things do have to change in the long run. What my fear is that the moment that the pandemic passes, whether that's when we get a vaccine or there's elimination or we've just let it run through society and it's killed who it's going to kill and whoever's left standing is here, that we go back to what we saw as normal and we do everything we can to boost the economy and to have an impact on GDP. And the worst thing about that is that a lot of the things that we do to do that are really bad for us. They're really gross forms of energy and electricity and gas and all that. They're things like deforestation. Do you know what I mean? Like
you're kind of saying normal as it was a crisis.
Yeah, totally. And so, but we kept doing all these things because they increased GDP. It was this ultimate goal of economic growth. And the reality was economic growth was actually hurting us in many different ways. I like nice things. I like having the money to buy nice things. I really like this new brand of vegan feta that costs, more money than I even want to talk about right now. But at the same time, like us working and constantly commoditizing ourselves so that we can have the money, so that we can spend the money because that's what we're encouraged to do. I mean, it is causing harm because it's having perverse incentives like let's cut down an entire forest or, let's, continue things like, gender inequality or the war on women or whatever you want to call it. Let's go to war, literal war. So I guess what I'm saying is that I hope what's been exposed during this time and what's been changed during this time, I hope that continues and there's not this like the problem's gone, so we revert. And I think a big thing about that, and if I can take it back to Marilyn Waring, because I know we need to wrap up, one of the things that she's really common for saying is it's not about looking backwards, it's about going forwards and about what change needs to make. It's not about going backwards and looking at, free education of, decades past and those sorts of things. It's about looking forward and what changes we can make for the future and future generations.
Amazing. I'm very inspired and encouraged, and I think keeping that, sight on the revolution while also instigating the incremental changes is something that fills me with hope. Thank you so much, Claudia. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you.
Same to you, Harry. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Take care. This might be a good time to quickly mention that all of the guest speakers on here have very generously given their time to chat with me over the Distillery, and that I've been operating on a kind of creative exchange where I offer an hour of time in exchange for their time here in the live stream studio. Just thinking about, I guess, labor and the ways in which we discuss alternatives to economies and systems of finance. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do subscribe. You can check out all the other episodes on distillery.site, as well as follow us on Instagram at distillery.site or on Twitter at distillery.site. We have new episodes streaming daily. Thanks so much for joining us, and take care, everyone.